Okay, good morning, everybody.
Turned it upside down.
The topic that we're going to talk about of Hanukkah is something that I've been banging the drum about for about 50 years. I don't know, Pete, if Carol still has her notes, Stern, about when I talked about Hanukkah. But when I taught this particular period in history, it used to take me 3 months to teach Hanukkah properly. And I'm hoping to give you the highlights of it I don't think I'll finish it today. Maybe today will be part one. I'll have to come back to the ending for part two. Hopefully I can do it in 2 sessions. But I will tell you the following to start off. Gemara Bava Basra, Yodalit Tesvav, talks about the Chasima Samikra, the canonization of the 24 books of Tanakh. Which books were included, which books were included, because at the time that Chazal decided what to call Tanakh, there were many, many, many different types of books in circulation. Many books. Initially, there were 22 books because Rus was part of Shoftim and Eicha was part of Yirmiyahu, and then that after the Churban, that they separated the separate books. But basically, there were many, many books, and these books were read by everybody, including Chazal. Ultimately, only those books that were considered to have Ruach HaKodesh were included, but every so often, for example, Ben Sira, which is similar to Mishlei, is quoted by Chazal, the Gemara. But the other books are not quoted, but they're referenced in different ways. For example, where do we know our story about Hanukkah? Where does it come from? There is an ancient book called Megillas Tanis, which recorded all of the periods during the Bayesheni where you're not allowed to fast or have Hespedim. And it mentions among the Purim, Hanukkah, Trajan Day, other many, many different days that we don't celebrate anymore. The only Hanukkah and Purim are mentioned in Megillas Tanis, and all it says in Megillas Tanis is that Chaf Hei Kislev, when the Chashmonaim were victorious, it's not allowed, it's 8 days, and you're not allowed to fast or give Hespedim. Period. That's all it says. 8 days, no Hespedim, no fasting. When this line is quoted in the Gemara Shabbos, Chaf Aleph, Chazal added an extra line, and they tell you the story about the miracle of the oil. But that was an addition that happened 300-400 years after the event. The rabbis added that piece in. Okay? Why they added it in, we can talk about maybe in session number 2. But the original sources talk about 8 days of Hanukkah, no fasting, no Hespedim. So we're going to figure out what Hanukkah is all about, why 8 days, and where the story about the oil may have come from, why it's there, and how we understand it. Yeah.
Isn't there a book of the Maccabees?
I'm going to come to that right now. There are several books that should be in your Jewish home library. Book number 1 is Josephus, the works of Josephus. He was a Jewish historian, an eyewitness to the Churban Beis HaMikdash. He lived in the 1st century. He was a Kohen. He fought in the rebellion against Rome, and then he was captured, and he wrote several books. He wrote the History of the Jews, the Antiquities of the Jews, which is a very pro-Jewish book, and it gives you a lot of important information. The Wars of the Jews was written in Rome when he was a captive from Rome, and you got to take some of the stuff he says there with a grain of salt. But Josephus was an eyewitness to many, many things that were going on in the time of the Bayesheni. Very important book to have. It's a thick book. It's available in English, The Whiston edition is probably the best, but there are many different. Read Josephus if you want to learn about Jewish history. The second set of books is the books of the Maccabees, Sefer Chashmonaim. Sefer Chashmonaim or Sefer HaMaccabim, the first two books are more important than the third and fourth. The first two books were written contemporaneous to the events of Hanukkah. These are the people that lived through it. These are the people that fought in the battles, and they recorded what happened. Very important historical source. It's so important that the rabbis read it all the time, because that's the only source for all the stories that we know about Hanukkah. Chashmonaim are not mentioned in Shas anywhere, except there's a mention in one place about the Bezdin of Chashmonaim who punished violators of certain rabbinic laws. Chashmonaim are not mentioned. The Yehuda Maccabee, not mentioned anywhere in Shas. Believe me, I looked. It's not there. All the stories about the children who died and then the sacrificing of the pig in the basin, all the stories about Antiochus and all that, where'd it come from? Sefer HaMaccabim. Read the book. First two books. There are four books of the Maccabees. The first two are contemporaneous to the events of the Hanukkah story. The rabbis read it. They had to have. Otherwise, where would we know what we know about the Hanukkah story? All the legends, all this that comes from the book of Maccabees. If you want to go further, there are other historical books to read. But basically, if you can get through Josephus and the book of Maccabees, it'll give you a greater appreciation and background for what the rabbis read. Because they read Josephus and they read the Sefer HaMaccabim, or else we wouldn't know anything about Hanukkah, all the stories. Again, we'll come to the Pach Shemen later. There are two cultures that were at war with each other, and I have to give you some historical background, because if you don't know the history, you can't understand what happened. And I will give you the bottom line first, and then I'll explain it. Hanukkah was not about a revolt of the Jews against the Syrian Greeks. I'll say it again. Hanukkah was not about a revolt of the Jews against the Syrian Greeks. It was a revolt, it was a civil war, basically, about traditionalists and assimilationists. And that's something that somehow gets lost in our Hanukkah, telling of the Hanukkah story. During this particular period, I'm talking in a period of the 1st century before the Common Era. I mean, the events of Hanukkah, the war of the Chashmonaim against their enemies, and they were Jews, other Jews, and Syrian Greeks. That war took place between 167 and 165 BCE. But the period that we're talking about starts around a little before then, 200-300 BCE. But we have to understand the flow of history. But Judaism was being consolidated by the rabbis at that time. Greek culture was in its efflorescence at that time. Basically, Greece celebrated a polytheistic culture, and the golden age of Greece was happening around this time, philosophers and all the writers. Judaism is predicated on divine revelation, prophecy, Ruach HaKodesh, Torah, mitzvos, Masorah. That's Judaism. Greek culture, on the other hand, is based on logic, scientific reason, faith in the intellect, science. And these obviously are in conflict with one another. One says God is the source of everything, the other says man is the source of everything. And that was part of the culture. And Judaism, if left alone, would let the Greeks do their thing, and the Greeks, unfortunately, did not let the Jews do their thing. Because part of, as we'll see, Greek culture meant getting everybody to think the way you think. For example, you couldn't vote unless you were a Greek citizen. But to be a Greek citizen, you had to speak Greek, you had to dress like a Greek, you had to worship at their temples and so forth. Let's start, the whole process begins, and I'm trying to condense this, but you need to know the background. Alexander the Great, the great conqueror, invaded Asia in 334 BCE. And he controlled a huge, huge area from Iran to practically to Egypt. And this brought about tremendous change in the cultural pattern in the entire Mediterranean area. There are two words you have to understand. There's Hellenic culture and Hellenistic culture. Hellenic culture is the classic period of Greece prior to Alexander the Great. The great philosophers, the playwrights, and so forth. Hellenistic culture, and this is the crux of Hanukkah, is the blending or the forced blending of these two cultures, of one culture subsuming the other. This is what Alexander the Greek pioneered when he became the emperor or the king of practically most of the civilized world at that time. His father was Prince Philip of Macedon. The king was supreme in their culture. And it was a whole social stratus. I don't have to get into it. But basically, Alexander the Great was 20 years old when he succeeded his father. He died at the age of 32. In those 12 years, he expanded the holdings of the Greek Empire many, many, many times. He was a great, not only was he a great leader and military mind, he was a brilliant man. He was a student of Aristotle. As a young boy, he was the Eloi, if I can use that expression. He studied under Alexander the Great. So he was a philosopher king. And what he did, his first official act, when the Macedonians conquered Persia, was to hold a mass wedding where 80 of his most prominent, Macedonians, officers, whatever, married Persian noblewomen in a mass wedding. And then he forced 10,000 of his soldiers to take Persian brides. And when you married the bride, she had to speak your language and adopt your customs. And that is how he introduced Greek, Macedonian culture into Persia. And his desire to merge the people is consistent in every country that he conquered. Greece became the main dominant culture. They had to speak Greek, they had to dress like the Greeks, and that's why in every country that he conquered, he had his officers marry the local women, for that reason. And Greek culture became the dominant culture in most of the civilized world at that time. Asia, again, from Iran down to Egypt. That's a huge swath of territory, tremendous amount of real estate that was under his influence, and Greek culture was the dominant culture, and they kind of lost their own indigenous culture, language, customs, etc. He died at the age of 32. He's a young man. Again, the life expectancy in those days was not that great altogether, but for a person who has accumulated so much power in a short period of time, it was a tremendous gap was left. Who's going to take over after Alexander the Great died? Who is going to maintain a power? Because not only was he a great ruler and a great king, but he was a great intellect, so he was able to manage and balance and juggle all the different politics and war and theory and so forth to keep it all together. There were very few Alexander the Greats. So when he died, you had a period known as Diadochi. Diadochi is a Greek word for generals or heirs, if you will. There was, in each area that he conquered, somebody was in charge, top general, supreme allied commander, if you will, whatever you want to call them. and they fought for control. Who's going to rule this tremendous empire? And again, I won't go into the tremendous amount of historical details here. Generals fought for control. I'm going to summarize. Basically, there was a civil war among the generals for control. And basically, it came down ultimately after about a century of fighting to two major families, two generals and their families, the Ptolemies and the Seleucidians. The Ptolemies controlled the area of Egypt, and that area, the Seleucidians controlled Syria and Palestine, or Israel at that time. And because Israel is located in between Syria and Egypt, they were always fighting for control of Israel. And sometimes the Seleucidians won, and sometimes the Ptolemies won. And Israel was literally caught in between, not only geographically, but philosophically. Who do we support? If we support the Ptolemies and the Seleucidians win, we're Haftarahs, and vice versa. And again, the historical details are fascinating, but we don't have time to go into it. But and there were a number of different Ptolemies. By the way, under one of the Ptolemies, the Torah, the Tanakh, was translated into Greek, and a huge library in Alexandria. A fascinating story by itself. That's another topic. Yeah.
So we see in Jewish heritage, there are people who have the name, whose name is Alexander.
Yeah, of course. Well, because Alexander was very good to the Jews.
That's what I'm asking. What did he do that was good for the Jews?
All right. He allowed the Jews to maintain their ancestral traditions, put it that way. He didn't force them to be Oved Avodah Zarah. He would like it if they would have spoken Greek, but they paid him a lot of money, and they let them alone. He was very good to the Jews. Alexander was very good to the Jews. And again, the simon of that is that so many Jews, my father was named Alexander. There are Hasidim, Alexandra Hasidim, named after Alexander. So he was good to the Jews. 32. 32. Yeah. Okay. So the two families, the Ptolemies and the Seleucidians, I won't go into all the battles and the fights. I will say, for example, that, well, I mentioned under Ptolemy II, the Torah was translated into Greek. We can make a lot of observations about a culture that strengthens people in their own beliefs, philosophical, sociological. There's a lot to talk. That's why it took me 3 months to teach this. There's a lot of stuff. I will tell you the following. Let's go now to approximately 200 BCE. In the family of Seleucus, the Ptolemies are down in Egypt, the Seleucidians are up in Syria, the other countries were divided up among other generals. We focus on these two, and Israel is literally in between Syria and Egypt, all right, geographically. And in the Seleucidian family, the emperor was either called Seleucus or Antiochus. Okay, now those are the family names. Antiochus III defeated Ptolemy in the year 200. And it brought political change, not necessarily a cultural change. And the Jews, fortunately, supported Antiochus III in his battle against the Egyptian Ptolemies. As a result, now this is Antiochus III is the father of the Antiochus of the Hanukkah story. Antiochus III, in gratitude to the Jews, and this is recorded in the Sefer Maccabim, it's recorded in Josephus, he gave them a tax exemption. He paid for fixing up the Beis HaMikdash. He prohibited the introduction of pig into Jerusalem. He gave special exemptions to all the Chachamim and the Kohanim. I mean, he was very, very good to the Jews in gratitude to their support. And the Jews thrived on the Antiochus III. Okay? Now, unfortunately, when Antiochus III died, and there's so much politics going on here. Among the Jews, there were the two families of Kohanim. And the Tobiads, Tuvia, and Chanya. Chanya is Onias. And these two families were, how should I put it nicely? To say the least, assimilationist Kohanim. They looked to the Greek leaders, whether they were Syrian Greeks or Egyptian Greeks, and they bribed them both. And that's how they got their position as Kohen Gadol, through bribery, because the Syrian or the Egyptian ruler at the time would appoint them as Kohen Gadol. And they led a whole faction of Kohanim, who assimilated as much as possible to the Greek style. And again, I urge you, read Josephus, read the book of Maccabees, the fights between the Onias family and the Tobias family, Chanya and Tuvia, brothers killing each other, families fighting with each other.
Wally,
Yes.
is that why the Kohen Gadol was interviewed? Why they, before he went into the Kodesh?
Okay, so Nathan's referring to the Mishnah in Maseches Yuma, which talks about the Chachamim would interview the Kohen before Yom Kippur to make sure he didn't have any, anti-Orthodox sentiments, or whether he was a Tzeduki, a Sadducee who denied Torah Sheba'al Peh. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but the Tzedukim, who caused a lot of problems for the Chachamim a century later, were descendants of these Chashmonai Kohanim, the assimilationist Kohanim. So, but it referred to Tzedukim a century later. But at this point, the Kohanim were so assimilated. It's hard to imagine. The Book of Maccabees and Josephus both tell us, and they represented a large segment of the population, because they figured if we are Greek in outlook, if we speak Greek, if we dress like Greeks, then we'll get better civil service jobs. We'll do better in the community. So ad kidei kach, the Kohanim would leave their avoda in the Beis HaMikdash and engage in the Olympic sports. Now, what was the dress code during the Olympic sports?
Naked.
You were naked, except for the patassos, the little hat that they wore on their head. Well, it wouldn't do for Jewish males to appear naked if they were all circumcised. It would point out that they're Jewish. These Kohanim, it's bad enough that they went to the games and participated, discus throwing, everything else. They underwent painful surgery to hide the fact that they were circumcised. I can't even think of it. Josephus talks about it, Sefer Chashmonaim both talk about it. These Hellenists, and basically, and I'm really just summarizing all these things with Onias and Tobias, all these different Kohanim. But and interestingly, one of the quotes in Sefer Chashmonaim, where is it? There was no Avodah Zorah yet in the Beis HaMikdash. I'm looking for a quote. Well, anyhow, it talks about Chanya, the high priest, and then an editorial comment they add, no priest was he. In other words, they realized this guy was really a total assimilationist. But this began the conflict between the assimilationist Jews and the more traditional Jews, who were powerless to do anything. They observed Torah, they observed all the Jewish practices, yet the Kohanim and the aristocracy were the ones who wielded the power. So that you began in 175 BCE, for example, one of the Jason, one of the Kohanim, received citizenship status. And he began, at that time, Antiochus IV had now become the ruler in Syria. And all the Kohanim owed their position to being appointed by the emperor, and they bribed him and so forth and so on. He visited Jerusalem, which was now totally Greek externally, except for those Hasidim, as they were called, who kept the Torah. And he looted the Beis Hamikdash treasury. He did some terrible things. Antiochus wanted to change Jerusalem from an ethnos, a religious group, which it was under his father, to a polis, which is basically a Greek city-state. And that was part of the conflict going on between the two different Jewish groups. Suffice it to say that Antiochus the fourth was responsible for more Hellenization of Jerusalem. He didn't externally do anything against the Jews. He just wanted it known that Jerusalem is now going to be a Greek city-state. And if you don't follow the rules, then you will be excluded from any political ascension or any good jobs and so forth and so on. Antiochus, I just mentioned this in passing, was not a balanced human being. Even the Greek historians, Polybius, famous Greek historian, describes his strange, erratic behavior. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Magnificent. Everybody referred to him as Antiochus Epimanes, the Meshuggah, because he did strange things. He would go out in the city and he would throw out money and candy to people, but to his officers, he'd give them sticks and stones. He used to like to trip people in the bathhouse. I mean, he did a lot of very bizarre types of things. He didn't behave like a king. He would wander out in the streets. He would talk to common people, which the king normally doesn't do. He would get up on stage at the theater and dance with the actors. He would talk to strangers. Again, he was called Epimanes. And again, he wasn't a balanced individual, but he did have a political sense. And he was interested. Rome was now on the ascent. Up until now, we're talking about Greek culture. But Rome was now coming up. And Rome was going to become the leader of the civilized world at that time. Greek culture was kind of fading, except among the Hellenists. And he wanted to appease the potential Roman rulers, the new guys that are coming up to rule Jerusalem. And I'm sorry? We're talking about the 170s BCE. And what he did was not because he believed in any particular cultural beliefs of the Greeks or the Romans. He simply was looking out for his political future. And Hellenism, the blending of Greek culture and the subject nation culture, was really something that the Hellenists pushed more than Antiochus did. Eventually, they realized that this was something that they needed to do to gain control. Because how would it look? How would it look to Rome that he couldn't control this unruly group of Jews who insisted on following their ancestral behavior? They went to their temple. They didn't work on Saturdays. They didn't eat pork. It doesn't look good. I can't control this little group. So he tried to control them. He tried to control them by doing certain, how do I say, issuing certain decrees, not because he was anti-Jewish, but he was pro-Greek or pro-Roman culture. He didn't oppose Jewish tradition. He simply wanted them to become like everybody else. And if you take away Shabbos and Talmud Torah and Bris Milah, those are three basic issues of Judaism, then maybe you'll blend in with everybody else. And to enforce this, the Hellenistic Kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash joined forces to do this. Not only ad kedei kach, but they even had an idol set up in the Beis Hamikdash, and they even renamed Yerushalayim after Apollonius. So when that happened, and again, I'm skipping a lot of stuff because we just don't have the time, but basically, and Josephus describes it as erasing the particularism of the Jews. The Jews are a particularistic people. We do things different than everybody else. When you get rid of the particularistic aspects of Judaism, then there's no more Judaism left. When this began to become the official law of the land, the Hasidim, as they were called, the traditionalist Jews, said, that's it. You're putting a temple in the Beis Hamikdash. The Kohanim are not Kohanim. We're leaving. And they abandoned Yerushalayim in 167 BCE. It wasn't just Matisyahu and his family. All the traditional Jews left. And they went into the hills and they began a guerrilla war campaign to basically retake Yerushalayim from the Hellenistic Jews who occupied the Beis Hamikdash and who controlled the politics of Jerusalem. I'm going to quote from the book of Maccabees. At that time, lawless men arose in Israel and seduced many with their plea. Come, let us make a covenant with the Gentiles around us. Because ever since we have kept ourselves separated from them, we have suffered many evils. Because they blamed the fact that they weren't assimilated to why they were suffering. And then again, they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, etc., etc., etc. Describes the operations to disguise their circumcision. And the revolt initially was traditionalist Jews against assimilationist Jews. That was the civil war. The Greeks, the Syrian Greeks got involved in that war because they were entrusted to put down this revolt. And all the stories about the Hashmonaim and Matisyahu and his sons comes from the Book of Maccabees. What time is it now? Okay, let me finish up today. I have to finish this on Friday because there's just so much more, and I won't get to the actual oil story until Friday. But I'll talk about the 5 sons of Matisyahu. They were all Kohanim, the whole family. Matisyahu was not from the family of the high priest. Why it says so in Ahanisim is a separate issue. But they were all Kohanim. But as you know, a Kohen cannot serve if he has a physical imperfection. Because Kohanim have to be really handsome men. They can't limp. They can't have be bald. They can't have other physical deformities. They have to be perfect species. Every one of Matisyahu's sons had a nickname in Greek referring to some physical deformity that they had. They were Kohanim, but none of them can serve in the Beis Hamikdash. One was Gadi, he was a gimpy guy, he had one leg toward the other. One was a Tassi, one was a Maccabeus, we'll come to that in a moment. An Oran, his skin was very like an albino type of thing. Aphus, had a club foot, whatever, we're not sure exactly, but it's a physical deformity. Yehuda was called Makban in Hebrew. Maccabeus is a Makban. A Makban, according to the Mishnah in Bechoros, is one of the physical deformities which won't allow you to serve in the base of Midrash. A makban is a macrocephalic. A macrocephalic where the forehead protrudes and the back of the head sticks out, a mallet head, want of a better name. But a makban is possible from the avoda. You can still eat truma, but you're possible from the avoda. So
Why?
1 second. And a makban is spelled with a kuf. All right, makav is a kuf, not a chaf. The popular spelling of Maccabee is with a chaf to fit into the words. Hashem fits in nicely. But a makban is spelled with a kuf, in Greek, which is a kappa. Yes, go ahead.
Would a hidden deformity disqualify a Kohen?
With what kind of deformity?
Hidden, where you couldn't see it.
Well, if you knew about it, I mean, if it was hidden and you didn't see it, these are physical deformities.
Right?
It-
The reason I asked the question is because they said that if he had Christ bathing, he couldn't perform.
Correct. Well, that was physical.
All right, but it was hidden. It wasn't in plain view.
It wasn't in plain view, but when they went to part of the avodah was going to the mikveh on Yom Kippur, so they would see it. So clearly that was
Okay.
anyway. So Yehuda Maccabee was not the mighty hammerer who, he was a mallet head. He was a macrocephalic. That's just one of the little things that if you read Greek or if you read the English translation of the Greek, both in Josephus and the book of Maccabees, you will see. So just to conclude for today, and we'll talk about the battles and why. I should put it this way. The reasons why Hanukkah is 8 days is not limited to the cruse of oil. And we'll talk about the various reasons for that. Apollonius tried to quell the civil war. He was a general. Apollonius tried to quell the revolt in 168. Antiochus followed up in 167 to try to homogenize the Jewish community. And that's when the revolt began in earnest. And even though they tried to prohibit Shabbos, Bris Milah, monthly celebration of the king's birthday, slaughtering of the pigs and so forth, burning Torah scrolls, no more korbanos, all of this precipitated the civil war between the traditional Jews and the Syrian Greeks. Now, the Jews did not go after other Jews initially, although the Bezdin of the Chashmonaim did, but they were fought against the Syrian army who was sent in to put down this civil war. Because how was it looking to the upcoming Roman authorities if this little country between Syria and Egypt couldn't control this unruly band of Jews? So we'll pick up with the revolt and what led to the Hanukkah story. If you could get a hold of the Megillas Tanis, the original Megillas Tanis, it would be very informative. And also, again, Josephus and the first two books of Maccabees are essential reading if you want to learn about Hanukkah, because all you have in Jewish sources is that one line about the Pach Shemen. That's it. Nothing that led up to it. We'll talk about why there's no Maseches Hanukkah and so forth. Hopefully on Friday we'll do part 2. There's so much to do here, but we'll stop here for today. Yeah.
Okay, on the Yom Kippur davening, we talk about how the Kohen Gadol was so frightened that if there's anything wrong with his thoughts or anything, he would die when he walked.
Correct.
So how did all of these, unworthy Kohanim survive?
Well, again, these unworthy Kohanim, as you put it, eventually became the Tzedukim, who had major fights with the Chachamim, and ultimately they were gotten rid of. But nevertheless, as Nathan pointed out, every year, Erev Yom Kippur, the week before, they would sequester the Kohen Gadol and they would check him out to see if he had any Sadducean tendencies. Because it was a big, big problem, because they denied the validity of Torah Sheba'al Peh. I'll tell you one story. I must tell you one story, and then I'm